Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Tonight's tale, continuing the story of Crow House, is I'm Still Trapped in the House by JoshuaAndrew, 1985. Since my last post here, I actually cleaned up my act a lot. My memory's still fuzzy on how I got a hold of a contraband laptop, but the guards took it away as soon as I made all that fuss. Anyway, I got a great public defender who was able to save me from the murder charges and even the B&E of the old Crow House. He truthfully argued that we were in there because of a reasonable suspicion of foul play, and we rightfully searched the place for survivors after finding Mr. Crowther dead in the living room. It helped that none of the prosecutor's experts could agree as to how exactly Thor had died, and they never found Tommy's body. I was still convicted of the assaults after I'd been imprisoned, but I took a plea deal and got just 5 years probation, the majority of which I would spend at Oregon State Hospital. Of course, nice as my lawyer was, I never fully trusted him. I had made a sort of peace with the thought that I might still have been trapped in the Crow House. Its illusions and specters looked, felt, even smelled real. I can still remember the pain of feeling a dog ripping the flesh off my arm. So it took a good year before I could relax. You can only be paranoid for so long, then you get just tired of all the fear. I decided that if it was a hallucination, I would just wait and see where it all went. And truthfully, I figured that if the house could create illusions this good, I was a dead man no matter what I did. Either way, I managed to make life work at the hospital for long enough. Eventually, my memories of the house faded so I could start to sleep naturally again. I made lots of progress with my therapist about issues that had plagued me before the Crow House, and I eventually got a clean bill of health from the hospital. I got a job as a librarian, of all things. I'm heavily tatted, but none of them are on my neck or face, so I got to work in a long-sleeve sweater with white gloves. I've always considered myself an intelligent brute, but after a haircut and a shave, I actually started to look like I belonged here. I didn't completely let the Crow House slip from my mind, though. I used my position to study up on that location and found some pretty interesting stuff. Police reports and newspaper articles revealed that the land the Crow House had been built on had been terrorizing people long before Mr. Crowther owned it. Probably the most interesting example was an incident with the people who owned the land before Mr. Crowther. Only the husband made it out of a house fire that he freely admitted to setting himself. He had a wild tale about moving across the country for his job, only to find his new office was a maze of cubicles that he couldn't get out of. According to him, half of his new co-workers were out to kill him, and the others seemed just as scared and lost as he was. He said he must have wandered those gray walls for days without ever finding an exit. Instead, he finally managed to find a lighter and set the nearest cubicle ablaze. Of course, he was only trying to get firefighters to come to the rescue, but it was only when the fire had spread too far to stop that he suddenly realized he was standing outside his own home. The rest of his family had been asleep, and they were unable to be helped. 3 days after his arrest, he hung himself in jail, just like I almost did. The fire cleared the way for Mr. Crowther to buy the land and build that monstrosity of a house that I'd been trapped in. While they didn't have as much trouble as I did, it still took the police weeks before they eventually cleared the house of the 4 bodies. Oh yeah, that's another reason why I managed to get off so light. Besides Thor and Mr. Crowther's body, they also came across the bodies of a couple in the basement. They had both died of heart attacks and were found sitting in a corner, holding each other tight. The couple had died long before Mr. Crowther, and it helped paint him in a bad light, even though there wasn't enough evidence to definitively say what had happened to him, or to them. All this news made me feel simultaneously more and less sane. I clearly wasn't the problem going into the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was forever corrupted by it, even if I really had escaped. Now, you might be wondering why, if I suspected I was still in the house, I would trust anything I was reading. Well, I'd never read anything like this before. I figured that when I was speaking to someone, if I was still in the house, then it was like I was speaking to the house. Same with reading. That information had to come from somewhere. I mean, true, it could have been the house messing with me, but I thought it was more likely that it would brag about itself. All of this got pushed to the side when I met Sandy. Every day she would bring her kid in for my library's storytime hour. I finally got the nerve to just talk to her. Not only did I think she was the prettiest thing I'd ever seen, but I was worried that she was the trap that the house was building to. I was lonely enough, though, that I just went for it. Illusion or not, she was beautiful. And it turned out very single. We started dating, and suddenly the world got a lot brighter. It felt more real, too. I got to know her son, Mason, and he actually seemed to like me. So, you know where this is all going. First, life got great, then Sandy and I got married. I won Oregon's Librarian of the Year. I found out Sandy was pregnant with a girl. My life was now perfect. Too perfect. I'd never forgotten about the Crow House. Couldn't. It was always there in the back of my mind. When I got angry at Sandy and maybe took it a bit too far, she always forgave me too easily. Mason was too good a kid. My work was too easy for too much money. I tried to ignore the feeling in the pit of my stomach, and it was easy at first. I guess I really didn't want Sandy to be fictional. But then, a new book, at least new to me, was returned to the library. A history of a tribe that had split from the Modoc Native Americans that used to live around here. I started reading it to figure out which shelf it needed to be returned to. Just after the first page were two maps of the area where this tribe used to live. One was what the land looked like at the time they occupied the area. The other was the same image, but with a current map overlaid on top of it. The second map clearly showed the Crow House right next to the tribe's main camp. After seeing that, whether or not I was still in the house, I felt like this book was a message for me. So I kept reading. The tribe called themselves the Deniga Maclocks, which roughly translated to sun-setting people. They were sort of a cult that had been ostracized from the larger tribes for their beliefs. Basically, they thought the world was going to end soon. However, their leader had once come upon a cave with a long, twisting passage, and this man had had an epiphany on how to save the world, at least temporarily. He immediately started making sacrifices of the young women in his tribe. And when the world didn't end, his efforts were declared a huge success. He didn't just kill the girls, though. They were drugged and then carried deep into the cave with plenty of food and water. When a girl awoke, she would be free to try and find her own way back out. However, The author of the book theorized that the whole maze had been rigged, maybe with a stone covering the entrance. Nowhere could they find any evidence that anyone had ever survived this exceedingly slow execution. Plus, the tribe wouldn't have wanted a survivor. The whole point was for the young woman to have hope, but to ultimately fail. For her to consistently pray for the God's guidance, and for those prayers to get increasingly more and more heartfelt and desperate as time went on. Basically, they were trying to wring every last drop of devotion out of their sacrifices. And it worked, or at least it appeared to. They figured the gods wouldn't want to destroy a world as long as it could still produce praise this pure. Either way, using the death maze got so popular that they eventually had to kidnap young women from other tribes, then use people of all ages and all genders to keep a steady flow of wretched prayers coming. This led to a war with the larger tribes, and the Deniga Maclaks were eventually wiped out. Their conquerors feared the cave still, though. They thought that it was haunted with hundreds of lost souls that were still trying to find their way out. So they filled in the entrance and stayed far away from it. At this point, it came as no surprise that the location of the cave was exactly under the present location of the Crow House. The book did have one last shock for me, though. Immediately after finishing it, I looked at the author to see if I could maybe find and speak to them later. The book had been written by William Crowther. There was no author photo, but it couldn't have been a coincidence. I practically threw the damn thing away from me. The house was taunting me. Somehow it had delivered the book to me. The easiest explanation was simply that I was still in the house. I tried to reject that idea once more. I left work immediately and drove home. Sandy was on the phone with my confused boss when I got there, but she was already telling him that I wasn't feeling well. I just went to our bedroom and flopped on the bed to try and think things through. Soon, Sandy joined me and asked what had happened. I'd never talked to her about my stay in the mental hospital or what had happened in the Crow House. She had known about all my other stints in prison, but that's it. So I finally told her. When that ended, Sandy looked scared, but she told me that she believed that I believed it had happened. My boss had told her that it was clear I was having some trouble at work today, so I should go ahead and just take tomorrow off too, so we could have a 3-day weekend. Sandy started to say how we could use that time to relax together, get better, but I cut her off. I told her something along the lines of, "Don't you see how wrong this is? Bosses don't give you time off if you leave work. They fire you." We argued for a bit more, but I felt silly arguing with the house, because that's who I had to really be talking to. The house was pretending to be my wife. I told her that I was on to her. She had trapped me before, but she wasn't going to trick me anymore. The thing that called herself Sandy burst into tears. She told me that I was scaring her. She begged me to think of our unborn child, of Mason. I almost tore into her head then and there to see if there's anything alien about her biology, but then the house had Mason burst into our room while I was wrestling Sandy to the ground. In the end, I couldn't go through with it. Real or not, I couldn't hurt her. I didn't want to see Sandy hurt. After getting up and all of us calming down, I promised that I would get better. She gave me an ultimatum. Our child would be born in about a month, so she would stay with her mother during that time, and I had to use every resource that I had to get better by then, or else I wouldn't be allowed to be a part of this family anymore, or even to see the baby. At the time I thought, like it's actually mine. I just went along with her plan to get some peace and quiet. I tried to think of a way that I could escape, for real this time. And that's when I finally decided I would visit my father. We have a complicated relationship. The house wouldn't be able to accurately portray Dad given how repressed my own memories of him were. I showed up at his apartment with no warning, knocked. He opened the door angrily, but just stood there in shock for a moment, and then he started crying. He sobbed while telling me how sorry he was and how many regrets he had. This wasn't my father. My father couldn't go 5 minutes without hitting me. This was the house, just trying to show me what I wanted. Again. I pushed him. He balled up his hand in a fist for a second. I thought I saw the man who raised me again. Yet this imposter just dropped his fist and tried to pull me in for a hug. He kept apologizing, asking my forgiveness. He tried to tell me that he'd changed a lot over the last 20 years, probably because the house knew it wasn't fooling me. It had to come up with some excuse, and I almost believed it. Almost. Instead, I knocked the old man to the ground and pulled a hammer from my waistband. I cracked open his head, and I searched and searched for anything alien living inside. When I didn't find any, I wasn't sure how this worked. The only thing I was sure of was that bloody mess on the floor, that wasn't Dad. Not that it mattered to the police. After all, they were just the house too. So was the judge. That's why he was still so lenient. He put me back in the hospital again, this time for life. This house is really good at mind games. It's not revealing the charade until it thinks I've let my guard down again. For whatever reason, it has decided to let me have a laptop. Again, in universe, they told me that communicating with others would help me face my delusions. And once again, I have to play along. But only until Mike, the orderly, stops paying attention. Recounting everything that's happened has just been to keep my hands realistically moving over the keyboard. I know there's no one really out there. It's taking forever, but Mike can just keep watching me type merrily along. Eventually, he'll take a break, and that's when I can finally escape this house. Don't need long, just 5 minutes or so. Probably less than that, since I already used my spare sheets to make the noose last night. See, I'm escaping for real this time. So even if you think it's fake, remember what George Herbert said. Living well is the best revenge. The only thing I have to add to that is, even if you do think it's fake, checking out early only gives them what they want. Stay scary, wildlings, and make the most of your nights.